Good evening, everybody. It's Dr. Bob here at the Vitality Project with my partner in arms, Angela MacLeod.
Hi, Bob.
Hi, nice to have you tonight, Angela. Thank you. Thank all of you who are joining us on a Friday evening. We'd like to spend a few minutes with you and unpack today's post for the Vitality Project, which centered on the topic of rightful guilt and how guilt can be instructive. And we'll be talking, as we have before, about guilt in contrast with shame, which can be actually quite paralyzing. Angela, you and I met earlier, and we actually talked about how this can go in terms of a freeze response, but guilt kind of gets a bad rap, and I really want to promote it as being a very useful emotion. And let's talk about the title of today's post, which you can see online at the Facebook or also at our YouTube page. The title is How We Can Learn from Our Mistakes, and I truly do mean that. So I just want to open it up, Angela, and see where the spirits want to move tonight. Any thoughts about this topic of learning from our mistakes?
Yeah, thank you. Really important topic, I think. As I was reading the post earlier today and the other posts this week, I couldn't help but be reminded of my journey with in my recovery, where I was in the 12-step program and working the steps with a sponsor, and how I became willing and ready to face mistakes and my wrongdoings, which is part of the whole 12-step program, but it's also a part of other kinds of recovery, other kinds of spiritual work, really, too. Like in Dharma recovery or refuge recovery. And really, I see it more as what you've referred to earlier in other posts about being honest with ourselves, just really inquiring into who we are, what we do, and taking a look at that honestly. But I didn't grow up where that was something that was modeled very well, or if I did something wrong, I would get punished, that kind of thing. So from early on, there's like this big fear about acknowledging wrongdoings. It's almost more like the culture and the family life was, what can you get away with? If you get caught, you get punished. There was never, not in my memory, there wasn't much of a modeling for just owning up to something without even without even it being pointed out to you. So I'm so grateful for the 12-step program and having a process where I could begin to look at that with somebody, my sponsor, but also in the meetings where it was somewhat modeled, that that breaking it down and for me, the big fear about owning up to a wrongdoing is being rejected, being banished, being seen as something really horrible. It's like being seen as that mistake is then that's who I am, and that's all that people see. And so in the 12-step rooms, in the meeting rooms, you just start to get a feeling that you hear other people talking about their process, and you start to speak up. This is my experience about, what's going on, what maybe I did wrong, or what I'm ashamed of, and having that experience where people aren't rejecting you. So I'm deeply grateful for the 12-step program for giving me a start in sort of unraveling this big handicap that I think a lot of us have. And so really, the difference between shame and guilt, I think, is an important one. But for me, they've been very intertwined for a lot of my life. And it might be interesting to hear you talk a little bit more, too, about just even having kind of a shame baseline. So one of the things I've noticed is that I can be aware of something I did wrong, and I can feel guilty for it. I can feel like I'm responsible. That was a mistake. I can correct that, but I can also feel terribly ashamed of myself at the same time. So for me, that's taken a while to kind of tease those apart, not just in my mind, theoretically, but now how do I live that? Like, how do I like, okay, so I'm going to go back to the 12-step program where when I got to the point of doing amends for my wrongdoings, I was willing and ready to acknowledge I stole from my workplace. That was one of my horrible things that was really a burden for me that I felt terrible about. And with the help of my sponsor, first of all, she could hear me talk about that, and then she did not reject me. So I had a moment, I had moments of feeling, okay, I can bear this because somebody else is seeing it with me, helping me understand why I was doing that, what was going on with my addiction at that time that was part of that. And then really taking the time to skillfully approach how would I give my amends to my workplace, because these were people that I cared about too. This wasn't just a job that was easy come, easy go. It was a really important workplace, a lot of connections with people. So for me, going into that situation, motivated by wanting to correct my mistake, I needed to take time to work through the shame and learn about how could I skillfully do this in a respectful way for myself and for the workplace. And I have learned that the title, Learning from Our Mistakes, that was really an important learning process for me. So it was not only learning from the mistake, but it was learning how to get help, how to repair that mistake. And that's a biggie. Sometimes we make little mistakes, that you can just say, oops, I stepped on your toes. I'm sorry, I'm guilty. I did it. So it's huge. I think it's really a big topic, and it's really, really important in our whole recovery process. And even if you're not recovering from addiction, I think it's important as a human process.
Thank you. I appreciate very much all that you've laid out. And I just want to say ditto to virtually every point you made, including really affirming one of the most valuable aspects. I think it probably is the most valuable for me in terms of my own engagement with the 12-step program, working with a sponsor, working the steps, was coming face to face with what I'd only ever felt around wrongdoing, which was utter shame. Which ironically fed my addictive behaviors. And here was a method and a program that not only encouraged that we face what we've done wrongly, but required it. It was I couldn't skitter away because I would well have wanted to do that. And so it's kind of being put to the fire, put to the test, And I was for years really engaged in this. I, like you, grew up. Psychology would say that some of us grow up where it makes us more shame prone.
Okay.
The problem with using that term is itself can evoke shame unless it's seen really with compassion. And I know enough about my background, and we've shared about our respective backgrounds, that both of us, it's only understandable that we'd be more vulnerable to shame, maybe even than a typical person walking up and down the street. I personally think, and this is after 40 years of doing clinical work as a psychologist first, and more recently as a recovery coach, I think that what we're talking about is a lot more common than most of us are aware of. And part of what makes that so difficult to put our finger on, it's a little like putting your finger on mercury, it squirts away, is that shame for most of us is what one author calls the unthought known. Is that we know it in our bodies. We all, and I'll ask, and you know as well, I'll ask clients I work with, where do you feel shame in your body? And it manifests differently. For some people, it's in their chest, it's in their gut, it's in their face, they get hot, they can't make eye contact. It manifests very individually. So we know it, but we can't really think about it. It's kind of the unthinkable, the unsayable. And so I think it does, I think it's kind of a silent enemy for a lot more of us, very much the way that you're pointing it out. if we look at it in the context of recovery from addiction, and you know this material as well as I do, if stress is the #1 trigger for relapse to addictive behaviors, and that's been proven again and again in tons and tons of scientific studies, the #1 most stressful human emotion is shame. It's what we're talking about. And shame, as distinguished from guilt, is simply shame makes me bad. Guilt gives me notification that I've done something bad or wrong. I've made a mistake. Shame makes me a mistake. And it's that latter emotion that is not only devastating, it's very interesting developmentally, is that infants develop shame. Infants develop shame before guilt comes on. Shame comes almost immediately. It's a midbrain phenomenon. Guilt involves much more of the forebrain. It's a much more complex process. And so if you think about it, about the unthought known, it's no wonder that we feel it, but we can't talk about it, because the origins of shame in our experience growing up are nonverbal. I mean, we spend several years developing verbal capacity, and we experienced plenty of shame before that, some of us more than others. And so I think if we look at shame in the context of stress and look at stress in the context of addiction, then what we're talking about, this distinction doesn't become just like a intellectual hobby or head trip. It's actually not just a semantic game. It's really important. And you asked the question a minute ago, well, how do we develop these muscles? And I think the program has been very helpful, because you know as well as I, you can sit in a 12-step or a refuge or a Dharma recovery meeting, and people are talking about the most horrible things they've ever done. Stealing, lying, all the things that I've done and you've done and anybody else that's in that room has done. And there's not a shaming response. With the absence of a shaming response, you begin to develop the capacity, I think almost like muscles, begin to develop the capacity to use your forebrain to own up to things you've done, and don't make the mistake of falling down the sinkhole of shame. And I think it's just, for me, it's just like calisthenics or learning how to dance or learning how to drum. It's like you practice it and you become facile with it, but it takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, I agree. Well, another thing that popped into my mind as I was thinking about this topic was
Angela, let me interrupt you for just a second.
Okay.
Every minute or two, it sounds like there's something rotating. Like, is there something in your environment? Is there a fan or something? There's a buzzing that comes on, and I stopped whenever it came on. But when you talk, if it comes on, it masks your speaking. Do you know what that is?
It's the fan in my computer that I was telling you about earlier.
Oh, it's that. Let's just deal with it. Well, let's keep going. No, I'll tell you what. When it comes on, just pause for a second, and then I'll keep talking, because I hear it and you hear it, and people can just know that it's the fan in your computer. I didn't associate it with that. When my fan comes on, it's just continuous. It's this loud, obnoxious thing. Yours is kind of cyclical, it sounds like.
Interesting.
It'll come on every 30 to 60 seconds, and it only lasts for a few seconds, and so we'll just deal with it. We're fine.
Okay. All right. Okay, well, it actually has been worse earlier today, so yeah, now I think I can hear it.
Yeah, it's very audible on this end. It's very audible on this end. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. We'll just manage it. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about how starting with small things, like if a person is new at this idea of learning from our mistakes, learning from our, rightful guilt versus wrongful shame, or however you put that. Like I mentioned, stealing from my workplace, which was a really big thing in my opinion. But there's also lots of little things along life's way, where if a person is new at kind of building that muscle, maybe starting with the smaller thing. And I think about the person that I live with, and if you live with, most of us live with somebody or a family, just to be able to say, oh, I forgot to put the trash out, rather than just like glossing over it or being defensive if somebody else points it out. And I noticed for me, maybe that seems like just such a small thing, but I notice how I feel when I go ahead and acknowledge it. Yeah, I did that. Or maybe I will say I overslept, or, whatever the issue was. But it can be helpful to notice how it feels to just go ahead and acknowledge that. Sometimes I notice I feel defensive and I want to make excuses for it. Sometimes I notice that I'm aware of the impact on the other person. And then I might mention that and apologize for that. Sometimes I just feel ashamed, and I can feel that feeling of wanting to just like hide it, And so the idea of kind of breaking it down or starting with something small can be a helpful way to just kind of build that awareness and that muscle of skill, really, and responsibility.
Yeah. We didn't plan it this way, but let's use your fan as just an analogy. It's not the greatest example that will work with this. You had told me earlier today about your fan. I related to you that I have a fan issue that comes and goes with my computer. It's so funny that I didn't associate it to that sound. I was actually thinking it was an ambient fan. And then as soon as you said it's your fan, that makes a lot of sense. So we talk about it, but we talk about it in a way that hopefully we can just kind of work with it. And to me, that's, if we use that just as a rough metaphor or analogy, it's like guilt is like that, is that you just, you have a problem and you kind of work it out. Let's strategize around this. Let's not oversleep. What can we do to help us not to oversleep, or whatever? How can I help you not to step on my toe? How can you help me not to step on your toe? That kind of thing. I think guilt frees us up to connect and to be creative in a response. Now, if we moved into a shame response, let's say I go, "What the hell is that?" or something like that, and you coward, and we could get ourselves into an impasse, and that's what shame does. It's literally a dead end. It kills off our connection. It kills off creative responding to it. And shame really is the enemy, I think, of forward progress. I think guilt is instrumental to forward progress. So they're close cousins, but they're not at all the same in terms of the outcome. So I felt like that the fan, we just dealt with it and we move on, and there's no vestige from it. And you can imagine a different scenario with a different person. I was talking the other day to somebody about a former supervisor of mine. This is from 40 years ago, and this is an incredibly shaming supervisor. And I remember it was in the early days of personal computers, and the very early days, and they would have been very rudimentary, but we had a computer in the office. This is all interns, and we had to, I think, record test results, testing data, psychological testing data on it or something. And I and most of my fellow interns had virtually no experience, and this supervisor was a national expert in his domain. I'm not going to mention it because I don't really want to draw attention to him. It's the dynamic that's important. But he would just shame the ever-living whatever out of us. And I remember just going and just being petrified. And that's not going to help my computer, my very slowly developing computer skills. And all of us just kind of had this freeze response around him generally. And it came down to even trying to learn a computer. And it didn't make any sense. It wouldn't make any more sense to scold your fan for doing what it's doing, or scold you. He was scolding us for not knowing how to do computers. And that's no way to learn how to do computers. And so anyway, so we're talking about a life skill that's really important. And I think it's relevant to human fulfillment across the board. And I just like our being able to talk about it. For a lot of people, this distinction, and that's good. I think what you've added, Angela, is that knowing it is not sufficient. I can know out of it. I wrote papers in graduate school on shame and guilt. And if there's anybody that studies psychology, you're going to be well familiar with them. And then I went to this internship and had the shit shamed out of me, and all those papers didn't make a difference for me, And I think it really requires practice. And so I really appreciate your holding out, among other things. And we'll talk about this more over time, but that for anybody who's in recovery from addiction, I want to say family members are in recovery from addiction. There's a lot of shame that people experience. I did in my family. There's a lot of addiction in my family. I felt ashamed of my family. I felt ashamed of myself, as if my family's addictive behaviors were my fault, but I kind of felt guilty by association. And then in terms of cosmic justice, I got a full-on acquaintance with my own shame around it. And so I really recommend for anybody who's listening to this, and it doesn't matter to me if you're somebody who's seeking recovery from addiction or a loved one of somebody, is that there are skillful means that you'll get in most self-help support groups. I don't care whether it's Smart Recovery or AA or NA or Refuge Recovery or Recovery Dharma, or we just go down the list. one common theme is that you have to deal with the fallout of addiction, and addiction by definition knocks out our moral scruples, our moral discernment. And so there's a lot of things that we do that are messed up, and we've got to find some way to move through those. And I think any program worth its salt is going to be skillful at this. And it's a central gratitude that you and I both share for the programs we've been involved in, because as I've shared with you before, Angela, and I've shared here as well, is that if you go back 10 years ago, I think I was probably 90% shame prone, and now I'm about 10%, which is to say that I can do something and feel really bad and go down that hole. And somebody, if they want to shame me really badly, they can probably succeed if they try hard enough. But I used to be where if a feather went by, I would feel shame, and I don't feel that. And I really attribute that to grace. I really attribute that to the experience of being in programs like what we're talking about. And we'll talk in another occasion about the various practices that we use, including 𝗪𝗂 inquiries, and for me, forgiveness practice. I've dedicated myself to this because I knew that this was going to be this is going to be the watershed for me. If I didn't work this through, I was not going to stay sober. And some of you who are listening may feel similarly. Well, there's resource out there, and I want to direct you to those. And so come back for more conversations for sure about this. We're going to wrap up in just a moment, Angela. Any final words from you? Any final words from you?
No, well, just the recognition that as much as we talk about these things, or we even understand them intellectually, it can also, especially with shame, it can be completely different to actually be in shame, and be able to access this understanding. And so that whole idea of it's really got to be taken into a practice of some sort or another. And the other part is how finding kind, loving support, whether it's a friend or a therapist or a group, like I don't think I could work through all of this without other people's support around this. And so it really isn't just an intellectual educational process. It's an embodied relational process, because as you've said, you pointed out that some of this wounding happens in a relational mode early on, and that it can only heal in a relational mode. And I'm really getting that more and more in my life. Thank you.
It's part of what we bring to our relationship, and we even enacted it during our session here tonight with unwittingly. Good luck with your fan, my dear.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Angela. Angela will be back next Friday night here. Angela and I participate together in the Vitality Project groups that meet twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursday nights. Anybody who's watching that wants to join, there's been a banner that Jason puts up here that will that will link you to a free membership, and you can join us. But at the very least, be sure to come back next Friday, and Angela and I will continue to forge forward as we work towards liberating ourselves from the enslavement of not only addiction, but also this specific arm of it, which is around shame. And as I say to clients, I hope that you feel guilty when you do wrong. You want that kind of feedback, but I hope you don't feel bad. I hope you don't feel bad about who you are. And we'll keep working this until we all get it. Okay.
All right.
Have a wonderful evening and weekend, Angela. Thank you for tonight. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Be well. Take care, everybody. Good night.